At 8:52 on a Tuesday morning, a 27-year-old single mother stood in the marble lobby of Chicago's most expensive hotel with her wrists in handcuffs, still wearing the housekeeping uniform she'd put on before sunrise. Her name was Tessa Marlowe, and 30 employees watched in silence as the police walked her past the front desk where she'd clocked in every morning for 3 years. Then the elevator doors opened, and Celeste Hargrove stepped out. The billionaire whose name was carved above the entrance looked at the woman in the uniform, looked at the handcuffs, and laughed out loud. She told her staff to take a good look, because this was what she called a lesson. Tessa didn't cry, and she didn't beg. She lifted her chin and asked one quiet question, and for half a second, that laugh stopped. Celeste waved it off. She had a tower opening in 3 weeks, $400 million standing behind it, and no reason on earth to be afraid of a housekeeper in worn-out shoes. What she never noticed, because she'd spent her whole life never looking below her own floor, was the man standing behind the marble column near the elevators. Black coat, 33 years old, perfectly still. He hadn't moved since the first officer walked through the door. Half of Chicago knew his name. The other half was careful never to say it out loud. And the night before, he'd been standing in a hallway on one of the upper floors, and he'd seen something that nobody in that lobby knew about yet. If this story moves you, hit that like button so it reaches more people. Share it with someone who believes a person's worth isn't measured by the uniform they wear. And subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one deserve to be heard all the way to the end. Now let's go back to 5 o'clock that same morning, to a small kitchen on the south side of Chicago, where it all started. That kitchen was so small that, standing at the sink, Tessa Marlowe could reach the gas stove with one hand, and she knew the room so well that she could make coffee in the dark without turning on a light. She didn't turn one on now, because the ceiling bulb had burned out the week before, and she hadn't been able to buy a new one yet. The only light in the room came from the small lamp on top of the refrigerator, its sickly yellow glow falling across the wooden table where the paint had peeled away at one corner. She pulled a tin box from the top drawer, a box that had once held cookies during some holiday long ago, and lifted the lid with 2 fingers so it wouldn't make a sound. Inside was loose money, $1 bills folded into quarters, a few smoother $5 bills she had set aside separately, and a handful of coins she had sat counting twice the night before. She counted them a third time, not because she thought the amount would be different, but because counting money was the only thing left in her life that gave her the feeling she still had control over something. Maisie's follow-up appointment was at the end of the month. She was still short, and she knew exactly how much she was short, and she had considered asking for an extra evening shift at the laundromat 2 nights a week instead of 1. She was thinking about it when she heard bare feet touch the wooden floor behind her. Maisie was 6, standing in the kitchen doorway in pajamas patterned with stars that had faded from being washed too many times. Her hair tangled wildly on one side of her head, and in her hands she held her old sneakers. "Mommy, look," she said, her voice still hoarse from sleep, though her eyes were already fully awake. "I know how to tie them now. The bunny ears way, Mommy." Tessa closed the lid of the tin, slipped it behind her with practiced ease, then sat down on a chair and patted her lap. Maisie climbed onto it, placed her shoes on the table, and began her demonstration. She worked slowly, the tip of her tongue pressed against one corner of her mouth in concentration, and Tessa watched those tiny hands struggle with the shoelace, shaping it into 2 loops and threading them through each other, and she felt something inside her chest that was warm and painful all at once. "Done," Maisie said, holding the shoe up as though it were a trophy. "My teacher said I'm the 3rd kid in my class who knows how to tie shoes." "I think you're the best one," Tessa said. "You say that because you're my mommy." "That's right. I'm allowed to have a favorite." Maisie laughed. The wide-open-mouthed kind of laugh that wrinkled the bridge of her nose, then rested her head against her mother's shoulder and fell quiet for a moment. Tessa knew that silence. It always came before a question. "Mommy," Maisie said, "was Daddy afraid of fire?" Tessa didn't answer right away. She ran her hand over her daughter's hair, gently working apart a tangle near her temple, and she did it more slowly than she needed to. "Of course he was, sweetheart," she said. "Everyone's afraid of fire." "Then why did he still run inside?" "Because someone in there needed him," Tessa said. Maisie considered this with the solemn seriousness children brought to important things, then gave a single nod, as if she understood, and asked whether there would be toast that morning. There was toast. Tessa made 2 slices, spread a thin layer of butter on one and a thicker layer on her daughter's, then sat watching Maisie eat while she put on her uniform. The hotel's pale gray housekeeping uniform was worn thin at the cuffs and had been pressed smooth the night before. She turned the breast pocket inside out and checked the stitching beneath the lining. The thread had come loose again, as it did every week. She took a needle and thread from the drawer and sewed Jessie's firefighter badge inside the pocket lining, 3 stitches at the upper corner and 3 at the lower one, exactly as she had done every morning for the past 3 years. No one at the hotel knew it was there. That was something private between her and the man who no longer came home. She put on the shirt, fastened the buttons, and rested her palm over the left side of her chest for 1 second, only one, then roused Maisie from her daydream about toast so she could take her to Mrs. Ray's apartment at the end of the hall. "I'll pick you up on time this afternoon," she said at the door. "Promise me." "I promise." And the sky was still dark when Tessa Marlowe walked down the stairs of her apartment building, adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and headed toward the bus stop to catch the first bus downtown, with no idea that the promise she had just made would be the first promise in her life she couldn't keep. By the time the first bus began rolling toward downtown, the lights on the top floor of a nearby building were still burning from the night before. In the conference room, where a glass wall overlooked the lake, 3 men in suits sat together on one side of the table, while a 4th man sat alone at the head on the opposite end. Ronan Cale said nothing for nearly the entire meeting. He leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on the folder, his eyes lowered to the tabletop instead of looking at anyone, while the other 3 took turns presenting their case. They talked about a delay. They talked about circumstances beyond their control, about the market, about a third party who hadn't honored its commitments, and the voice of the last man to speak began to quicken halfway through, the way a man's voice did when he could hear himself talking and didn't believe what he was saying. Sweat glistened on his forehead even though the room was cold. When he finished, no one said anything more. The clock on the wall made no sound. The air conditioner made no sound. The silence stretched so long that the man sitting closest to the door raised a hand to loosen his tie, then lowered it again when he realized what he had just done. Ronan opened the folder, turned one page, then closed it. "Have you finished presenting your case?" he said. It wasn't a question. 3 heads nodded. "Then listen to me," Ronan said, and his voice wasn't any louder than before. "When my father faced something like this, he gave people 1 day. 1 day. No more. I'm giving you until the end of the week." He rose and fastened the button of his jacket. "So don't thank me. Be grateful he's already in the ground." The other 3 men sprang to their feet almost at once, their chairs scraping briefly across the wooden floor, and they lowered their heads, not with the courteous bow of men in a conference room, but with the bow of men who had just been granted permission to leave a place they hadn't been certain they would ever walk out of. They left. The door closed behind them. Ronan stood beside the glass wall, looking down at the river of headlights flowing along the avenue below, and his assistant, a young man named Peter Vance, who had worked for him for several years, entered with a tablet in his hand. "You're scheduled to visit Hargrove tonight," Peter said. "They want to show you the progress on the upper floors. They reminded us that the grand opening is only 3 weeks away." "I know it's 3 weeks away." Security sent over the weekly report. "The entire upper section is still operating on our own system and hasn't been connected to the hotel's network. The hallway cameras, the elevators in that section, all the data feeds directly to our servers and is stored separately." Ronan nodded. It was a condition he had demanded from the beginning, and one he demanded in every project his money entered. Not because he distrusted anyone in particular, but because his father had taught him one lesson about business that he still carried with him to this day. The most expensive thing in the world was trusting a report written by the very person being inspected. "Have they raised any objections to it?" he asked. "No. They signed off on it from the beginning. Honestly, I think they've forgotten that condition even exists." The door opened again, and Fergus Doyle walked in without knocking, because Fergus Doyle had never needed to knock on any door in that building. He had been at Ronan's father's side since before Ronan was old enough to drive, and now his hair was almost entirely gray, and his body had grown somewhat heavy, yet he still moved through the corridors as though the building were his own home. In his hand was a folder with a blue cover. "Have you signed this yet?" Fergus asked, setting it on the table in front of Ronan. "What is it?" "The Hargrove addendum. Just the last few pages, the section authorizing the next disbursement." Fergus pulled out a chair and sat down, exhaling like a man who had been on his feet all morning. "I brought this project to you," remember? I sat with them until 2 o'clock in the morning. Sign it so I can go home and get some sleep. Ronan picked up a pen, turned to the final page, and signed. There, Fergus said, gathering up the folder and giving its cover a gentle pat. That tower is going to be the most beautiful thing that has ever carried your name. Trust me. The night before, when the city had extinguished half its lights, Tessa Marlowe was still at the hotel. Her shift had ended that afternoon, but the evening crew was short-staffed, and they had called her back, and she had agreed because another shift meant more money in the tin box, and because Mrs. Reyes at the end of the hall never minded keeping Maisie overnight. They told her to hurry upstairs and clean the large suite on the top floor, the one with 2 windows overlooking the lake, because a guest would be checking in the next morning, and the preparation staff had just left. Tessa pushed her housekeeping cart inside, and she worked in the same order she had followed for 3 years. The bathroom first, the bed next, and the sitting room last. When she reached the sitting room, she pulled the 2 throw pillows from the armchair so she could vacuum between the cushions, and her hand touched something hard. She pulled it out. It was a velvet-covered box about the size of her palm, its lid partly open from being crushed beneath the cushion. Inside, resting on white silk, was a diamond bracelet. The ceiling light struck it, and the diamonds broke that light into tiny fragments scattered across the back of her hand. Tessa knew nothing about precious stones, but she didn't need to know anything about them to understand that what she was holding was worth years of her labor, worth more than everything she had ever owned, put together, worth many times the amount she was still short for her daughter's follow-up appointment at the end of the month. She stood there, and for the span of a single breath, she thought of the appointment slip taped to the refrigerator door at home. Then she closed the box. She didn't call anyone, didn't take a picture, and didn't put it in her pocket. She held the box in both hands, the way a person held something that didn't belong to them, keeping it level in front of her chest, and walked out of the suite, leaving her cart exactly where it was. She went straight to the elevator and pressed the button to go down. Gordon Slate's office was on the mezzanine behind the lobby, and the light was still on. He was the director of operations, the man Tessa greeted every morning who never greeted her in return, a man of about 45, who always looked as though he were occupied with something more important than whatever was happening in front of him. Tessa knocked on the door. "Come in." She entered and placed the box on the edge of his desk. "I found this in the suite upstairs." It was wedged behind one of the chair cushions. Gordon Slate looked at the box. He didn't look at her, only at the box. And for one very brief moment, he said nothing at all. A moment she would remember many times afterward, and never understand why she hadn't sensed that something was wrong. Then he opened the lid, closed it again, and smiled. "Good. You did the right thing. May I sign the log, sir?" "What log?" "The log for property left behind by guests. The rules say I have to sign it." Slate looked at her for a second, then pulled a hardcover ledger from the cabinet behind him, opened it to a blank page, and pushed it across the desk. Tessa reached for her pocket and remembered that she didn't have a pen. She never carried one, so she went to the front desk, borrowed one from the young woman working the night shift, then returned. She wrote the date, the time, her name, and a description of the item. She wrote the floor and room number, then signed her name. Her signature was small, and the final stroke trembled slightly, because she had been on her feet working since morning. When she looked up to return the pen, her eyes passed over Slate's desk, where 2 folders lay beside each other, both open to the same page. She didn't read them. She only saw that the 2 pages looked alike, and yet somehow didn't, each bearing the same bold heading at the top, with the words, "Fire Protection System," though the table of figures beneath it was longer on one page than on the other. She didn't understand any of it, and she had no reason to. "Thank you," Slate said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. He had closed both folders. "Go home. It's late." Tessa stepped into the hallway, and at the far end, outside the elevator reserved for the upper floors, a man in a black coat stood waiting with his hands in his pockets. He wasn't looking at his phone the way everyone else did while waiting for an elevator. He was looking at her. It wasn't the kind of stare that made a person uncomfortable. It was the gaze of someone trying to remember something, and his eyes lingered for quite some time on her 2 hands, on the empty space in front of her chest, the exact place where, only minutes earlier, she had held a velvet box in both hands. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside, and the doors closed behind him, and Tessa Marlowe walked toward the employee exit, with no idea that the man she had just passed was the only person in the building who had seen her do the right thing. Gordon Slate remained motionless in his office for a long time after the housekeeper's footsteps had faded completely from the hallway. The velvet box lay on the desk before him, and beside it was the property log, still open to the page, where her signature hadn't fully dried. He stared at that signature as though it were a crack in a pane of glass. There was no anger in his mind, only a rapid chain of calculations, the kind of calculations a man could make only after fear had carried him all the way back to calm. 4 more days. He repeated the words inside his head. 4 more days. And now there was a handwritten entry recording the date, the time, the floor, the room number, and the name of a witness, sitting in a ledger that anyone could open and examine. He raised a hand to his hairline and found it damp. Then he pulled the ledger closer, pressed his thumb against the binding, and tore out the page. It didn't come away as cleanly as he wanted, leaving a jagged scrap caught in the spine, and he scraped at it with his fingernail, but it wouldn't come free completely. He gave up, closed the ledger, and put it away in the cabinet. He tore the page into smaller pieces and slipped them into his coat pocket instead of throwing them into the wastebasket in his office. Then he opened his computer, signed in with his administrator account, went to the equipment maintenance schedule, and created a routine maintenance ticket for the hallway camera cluster in the hotel's guest room section. Entering 9 o'clock that evening as the starting time, he clicked save. The system didn't ask him another question. He remained seated for a while longer, and as he sat there, he told himself that he didn't hate the woman. He couldn't even remember her name without looking at the signature. She would lose a housekeeping job, and people could always find another housekeeping job, while he would lose everything he had built over 20 years if he allowed this to go any further. He picked up the velvet box, turned off the light, and went down to the employee lockers in the basement, where no one remained at that hour. The following morning, Tessa Marlowe arrived for her shift on time, just as she did every day. She changed into her uniform, tied back her hair, and immediately realized that something wasn't right, because everyone in the locker room was speaking in hushed voices, and fell silent when she walked in. Then someone called her name from the doorway. 2 uniformed police officers stood at the entrance to the locker area with Gordon Slate and a hotel security employee. The older officer asked which locker belonged to her. She pointed to it. They asked her to open it, and she did, and inside, between an old sweater and a pair of rain boots, was the velvet-covered box. Tessa stared at it, and for a moment she truly couldn't understand what she was seeing, the way a person might stare at a familiar word spelled incorrectly and find that the mind refused to read it. "I turned this in," she said. "Last night. I gave it to Mr. Slate, and I signed the log." "What log?" Slate asked. "The log for property left behind by guests. You gave it to me to sign." "I borrowed a pen from the front desk." They brought out the ledger. The police officer turned through the pages slowly, one by one, and when he reached that place, everyone saw one very simple thing. The last page containing any writing was dated 2 days earlier, and everything after it was blank. Tessa bent down to look at the binding, and she saw the jagged piece of paper still caught there, and she pointed to it, but no one followed her finger. "Check the cameras," she said, and her voice was still calm, the calm of someone certain that the truth was a thing that could simply be brought out and shown. The hallway camera on that floor, or the camera outside the office. Both of them would have recorded me carrying the box downstairs. The security employee glanced at the tablet in his hand, tapped the screen several times, then spoke with the detached calm of someone reading a weather report. "The camera cluster in that area has been under scheduled maintenance since last night. There's no footage." Tessa turned to look at him. "Maintenance. That's right. Routine maintenance." Heavy footsteps approached from the basement stairs, and Earl Dempsey appeared, the maintenance engineer who had worked in the building for nearly 20 years, still holding his work flashlight. He looked around once, then spoke more loudly than necessary. "I know this woman. She's worked here for 3 years. She found a guest's wedding ring last winter, and she returned it that very night. You've got the wrong person." "Mr. Dempsey," Slate said without turning around, "you're standing here during working hours, and I'm holding your performance review in my hands. Do you want to keep talking?" Earl Dempsey stood still. He looked at Tessa, then lowered his eyes to the floor, and he didn't say another word. They led her through the kitchen, up the service stairs, and into the main lobby, and Tessa understood at once that it was a choice, not an accident, because there was another route leading directly to the parking lot behind the hotel, and everyone who worked there knew it. At that hour, the main lobby was crowded. Guests waiting to check out stood in line at the front desk. Bellhops waited beside stacks of luggage, and the morning staff who had just received their shift handover had gathered behind a stone column as if by silent agreement, and not one of them walked away. In the center of the lobby, beneath the high vaulted ceiling, a group of people in suits was walking in 2 orderly lines behind a woman with short platinum hair, and the woman was pointing toward the ceiling as she explained something about natural light when she stopped in the middle of a sentence. Celeste Hargrove turned her head. She looked at the 2 police officers, looked at the woman in the gray uniform walking between them, and showed none of the discomfort people usually displayed when something unpleasant unfolded in front of their guests. On the contrary, something in her posture seemed to relax. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse me," she said to her guests, her voice clear and carrying across the lobby. "We'll pause for a moment. I believe this is something you should see, because you're about to invest your money in a building under my management." She stepped out of line and walked toward them, her shoes striking the marble floor in a steady sequence of sounds that everyone in the lobby could hear. The older police officer stopped. Tessa stopped as well. "Ma'am," Tessa said, "please let me say just one thing. I turned it in last night. Be quiet." Celeste didn't look at her as she spoke. She turned toward the group of guests. "What you're witnessing happens in every hotel in the world, and what makes the difference isn't whether it happens, but how the person in charge handles it. In some places, they deal with it behind closed doors, write a courteous letter, and allow the whole matter to fade away. I don't." From behind the stone column on the left, Earl Dempsey stepped out from among the employees. He had set his flashlight down somewhere, and his hands hung loosely at his sides. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "let her say one thing." Celeste turned to look at him, and her eyes traveled from his face down to his work clothes and back again, all within the span of a single breath. "Who are you?" "I've worked in maintenance here for nearly 20 years. "Then you know where the employee exit is. Leave." No one moved. Then the head of security touched Earl's elbow, very gently, almost apologetically, and Earl Dempsey turned toward the service corridor. He walked slowly, and he didn't look back. Celeste waited until the sound of his footsteps had faded completely. Then she turned toward Tessa and moved closer, so close that Tessa could smell her perfume, and she studied the uniform from collar to hem, slowly, like someone reading a page whose contents she already knew. "I can recognize people like you in a second," Celeste said. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't need to, because the lobby had grown so quiet that everyone could hear the elevator moving behind the wall. "And I feel sorry for whatever you're teaching at home." Someone near the front desk drew in a sharp, clearly audible breath. A guest holding a passport lowered it. Tessa stood still, and in that silence, something moved very slowly inside her chest. It wasn't humiliation, but the thing that came after humiliation, the thing that made a person raise her head instead of lowering it. She lifted her head. "Have you asked who shut down the hallway cameras last night?" The entire lobby heard the question because it was spoken at the precise moment when no other sound remained, and for half a second, exactly half a second, Celeste Hargrove's face went still. Then she waved one hand, a light, decisive gesture, the motion of someone brushing a fly away from the rim of her glass. "Why would I need to ask about the cameras?" she said, and she had already turned away before she even finished the sentence, already facing her guests again, already reclaiming the voice of their guide. "Please, let's continue. We still have the conference area to see." They led Tessa past the front desk, through the revolving doors, and out into the sunlight, and behind her, along both sides of the lobby, in the hands of uniformed employees standing close to the stone columns, dozens of phones were raised, and not one of their screens had gone dark. Outside, the sunlight was harsher than she had expected, and the patrol car was parked at the curb, with its rear door already open. The older officer, whose nameplate read McCrae, led her the final few steps across the sidewalk, and Tessa stopped before lowering her head to enter the car. "Ma'am," she said. It was the first time she had spoken since leaving the lobby. "May I ask you for one favor?" Sergeant McCrae was a woman in her late 50s, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, with the face of someone who had done this work long enough to no longer believe anything said during the first 10 minutes. "Go ahead." "There are 2 ways to reach my neighborhood," Tessa said. "If you take Kedzie, you'll pass the entrance to an elementary school. The children will be outside for recess around this time." She paused. "My daughter goes there." McCrae looked at her. She looked for a long time, longer than a simple yes or no required. And as she did, her eyes also took in the cuffed hands resting in front of Tessa's stomach, the way she held her back straight, and the way she never once glanced toward the crowd gathering across the street with their phones raised. Then McCrae took the key from her belt, removed the handcuffs, and put them away. "Get in the car," she said, holding Tessa lightly by the elbow, the way someone might help an older person step down from a porch. "We'll take Ashland." Inside the lobby, after the revolving door had stopped turning, the man in the black coat stepped away from the stone column. Ronan Cale had been standing there before the two police officers entered, and he hadn't moved once during everything that followed. Now he headed toward the side corridor, and Peter Vance caught up with him halfway there. "3 things, Ronan said without slowing down. "Get her name. Don't ask anyone in this hotel. Find out from someone outside." "Yes, sir." "Pull all the data from our servers covering the upper floors last night, from nightfall until the night shift ended. I want the original files, unedited and unconverted." Peter typed quickly on his tablet. "And the 3rd thing? Postpone this afternoon's signing. Hold the next disbursement as well." Peter's hands stopped. He walked 3 more steps before speaking, and his voice had changed. "Mr. Cale, that's our largest investment this year. They're counting down to the grand opening. If we stop now, the entire market will know by the end of the afternoon." "I know. Then what reason should I give them?" Ronan stopped. He turned and looked back toward the lobby, where the group of guests in suits was disappearing into the conference area, and where several employees still stood close to the stone columns, not one of them having returned to work. "Did you just see it?" he asked. "See what, sir?" "The way that woman treated someone who had nothing left to lose. In front of her investors. In the middle of her own lobby." He fastened the button of his coat. "People don't change their character according to the amount of money involved, Peter. That's exactly how she'll treat my money on the day something goes wrong in that building. And something will go wrong in that building, because people like her never stand close enough to the ground to know what's beginning to crack." Peter Vance didn't ask another question. He stepped into a corner of the corridor and began making calls. By noon, the story had traveled far enough. Celeste Hargrove sat at a corner table in the restaurant on the mezzanine with 2 business reporters and the corporation's communications director. And she was telling the story for the 3rd time that day, making it a little neater with each telling. She said that a housekeeping employee had stolen a guest's piece of jewelry. She said the hotel wouldn't tolerate such behavior, that trust was the foundation of the entire industry, and that she had handled the matter immediately and publicly, because concealment was what destroyed a brand. One of the reporters asked for the employee's name, and Celeste replied that she didn't remember it, that she didn't make a habit of remembering names like that, and she said it with a faint smile that made the communications director lower her eyes to her glass of water. Then someone knocked on the door. Celeste's personal assistant entered, bent close to her ear, and placed a printed sheet beside the untouched plate in front of her. Celeste glanced down. She read the first line, then read it again. The paper bore the logo of the Cale Fund, one brief sentence stating that disbursements had been suspended under the risk assessment provision, and a signature. She placed the paper face down on the table, looked up, and the smile was still on her face, but it no longer reached her eyes. "Please excuse me," she said. "Let's continue. Where was I?" At the station, they told her to remove her uniform. It was procedure, the young female officer handling her intake explained, because the uniform was what she had been wearing at the time of the alleged offense, and it had been listed as evidence. They gave her a gray paper outfit and pointed toward a small room screened by a curtain. Tessa took the paper clothes, then stopped. "May I have 1 minute?" she said. "There's a badge sewn inside the lining of the breast pocket. It doesn't belong to the hotel. It belonged to my husband. I stitched it in there. I just need 1 minute to remove the thread." The young officer looked at her, then down at the form in front of her. "I'm sorry. Intact means intact. Nothing can be removed from an item of evidence. It's only a few stitches. I understand, but I don't have the authority." Tessa nodded once. She didn't ask again. She stepped behind the curtain, removed the shirt, folded the uniform along the same creases she followed every night, and passed it through the opening in the curtain. Her hand paused for exactly half a second as her thumb brushed over the raised place beneath the lining. Then she let go. Sergeant McCrae stood a few steps away, signing another set of documents, and she said nothing. But she had stopped writing throughout the entire exchange, and when the gray uniform was placed inside a clear plastic bag and sealed, Her eyes followed it all the way to the evidence shelf in the corner of the room. In the interview room, they asked Tessa questions she had already answered. She answered them again, in the same way and in the same order, while the investigator took notes. She interrupted only once. "What time is it now?" The investigator looked at the clock on the wall and told her. Tessa closed her eyes for 1 second. "My daughter gets out of school at 3 o'clock, she said. "I promised I would pick her up. I don't need anyone to believe me about the bracelet. I only need to make one call so I can ask the older woman on my floor to bring her home." They allowed her to call. She spoke very briefly on the phone, her voice as ordinary as if she were merely saying she would be home late, and she didn't say a word about where she was. When she set down the receiver, the door opened, and a woman entered with a leather briefcase tucked neatly beneath one arm. She was about 40, dressed in dark clothing, and she walked directly to the table and pulled out the chair across from Tessa, without waiting to be invited. "My name is Dahlia Brooks. I'm an attorney." "I didn't hire an attorney." "No, you didn't," Dahlia replied softly. "Someone else did. That person wishes to remain anonymous. And before you ask, I'll tell you now that I won't reveal the name even if you do." Tessa straightened in her chair. "Then thank you, but you can leave now." "Why?" "Because I don't take things that don't belong to me," Tessa said. "That's the entire reason I'm sitting here. If I accept something now that I can't afford to repay, then I'm telling myself that what I did last night meant nothing." Dahlia Brooks didn't argue. She opened her briefcase, took out 2 printed pages, and placed them on the table, turning them so Tessa could see them properly. The first was a slightly dark, still image taken from high above a carpeted hallway. In the frame, a woman in a gray uniform was walking with both hands, holding a small box in front of her chest. A numerical timestamp in the lower corner showed the date and time. The second showed another hallway, narrower than the first, with pipes running along the ceiling. In that image, a man in a coat was walking toward the employee locker area, and the timestamp in the lower corner showed a very late hour, much later than the time Gordon Slate had claimed he left the building. Tessa looked at the 2 pages. She didn't reach out to touch them. "The cameras in that area were under maintenance," she said. "The hotel's cameras were under maintenance," Dahlia replied. "The upper floors operate on a different system owned by another party, and the person who scheduled yesterday's maintenance had no authority to touch that system. He may not even have known it existed." She pushed the 2 pages a little closer. "You aren't accepting anyone's kindness. You're simply taking back the truth that already belongs to you." Late that afternoon, Tessa Marlowe was released on bail. The charge still stood. The case remained open, and her gray uniform was still inside a sealed plastic bag on the shelf in the corner of the room. Annette Rowe, the hotel's general manager, hadn't been in the lobby that morning. She had been attending a meeting elsewhere, and by the time she returned, everything was over, and the first thing she heard was the Human Resources Director's account. Neat, complete from beginning to end, and entirely reasonable. She nodded. Then she went up to her office, closed the door, and sat in silence for a while. She had worked in the business long enough to know that neat stories were the ones that needed to be examined first. She called downstairs and asked someone to bring up the log for property left behind by guests. They brought it to her, and she opened it on her desk and began turning the pages slowly from the very beginning. She read every entry from the past several months: the scarves, the pairs of glasses, a laptop computer, a wedding ring returned on a winter night the year before, with the signature of the very woman who had been escorted out of the building that morning. Then she reached the last page containing any writing, and everything after it was blank. Annette ran one finger along the binding. A small, jagged piece of paper remained caught there, stiff and sharp. Exactly what was left behind when someone tore a page from a thread-bound ledger, without enough patience to make the tear clean. She sat staring at that scrap of paper for a very long time. Nothing in her life had prepared her to face something so small. Then she did something she would remember forever. She stood, walked to the filing cabinet in the corner of the office, and pulled out the documents for the new tower. She turned to the safety certificate submitted to the city, the document she had signed during a busy afternoon several weeks earlier, relying on a summary presented by the operations department, with every item marked complete. She looked at her own signature at the bottom of the page, the familiar handwriting she had produced thousands of times in her life, then set the document on her desk, lowered herself into her chair, and did nothing more for so long that the sky beyond the window changed color. That same afternoon, in the parking lot behind the building, Earl Dempsey sat in his truck with the door open and one foot resting on the concrete. He had just received notice of his new shift assignment. Beginning that week, he would no longer be responsible for the day shift. He had been moved to nights in the mechanical basement, the level running beneath both the old hotel and the new tower nearing completion next door, where there were 2 pumping systems, 2 service stairwells, and not a single person to speak to from nightfall until dawn. The human resources director had told him it was a routine staffing adjustment. Earl didn't question it. He sat there for a while, then reached behind the seat for his metal toolbox, dented at one corner, opened the lid, and lifted out the top tray containing his wrenches and screwdrivers. Beneath it was a stack of papers held together by a large metal clip. He removed 3 pages, 3 handwritten reports, all in the same handwriting, each submitted several months apart. All 3 described the same problem: that the fire suppression system on the upper floors of the new tower hadn't been fully installed and hadn't been connected according to the plans, and all 3 bore a receipt stamp in the upper right corner. He had submitted the originals to management. He had kept copies, not because he had been planning anything, but because he was the kind of man who kept everything. He read the final report again, folded all 3 pages in half, then took a business card from his breast pocket, one that a woman dressed in dark clothing had left at the security desk that afternoon as she was leaving the building. He dialed the number. The phone rang twice. Dahlia Brooks speaking. "My name is Earl Dempsey. I work in maintenance at Hargrove." He paused. "This morning I said one thing in defense of Miss Marlowe, and they told me to leave. By this afternoon they'd moved me to the night shift." "Where are you now, Mr. Dempsey?" "Sitting in my truck." He looked down at the 3 pages resting on his lap. "Miss Brooks, I don't know a thing about computers. My daughter had to set up this phone for me, but I've never thrown anything away in my life. I have 3 reports I submitted, all with official receipt stamps, and I think you should read them before that building opens its doors." It was fully dark by the time Tessa reached the hallway on her floor, and she stood outside Mrs. Reyes's door for about 10 seconds, arranging her face before she knocked. The door had barely opened when Maisie rushed through the gap, holding a large sheet of paper high above her head with both hands. "Mommy, look, I spent the whole afternoon drawing this." Tessa took the paper. On it, drawn in crayon, was a woman standing straight in the middle of the page, her hair tied high, wearing a red cape that streamed behind her, and beneath the woman's feet were 2 words scrawled in large pencil letters: "My mom." "My teacher told us to draw the person we think is the greatest," Maisie said. "I drew you. I only added the cape to make it pretty, because you don't have one." "Not yet," Tessa said. "I'll buy one someday." Mrs. Reyes stood in the doorway looking at her, and there was a question in the older woman's eyes that she didn't ask. Tessa thanked her in the most ordinary voice she could manage, then took her daughter home. She cooked noodles, sliced an apple to go with them, and sat listening as Maisie told her about a child in her class who had lost one shoe, and how everyone had gone searching for it. Tessa laughed in the right places. She asked questions in the right places. When Maisie had brushed her teeth and climbed into bed, Tessa remained sitting on the edge of the mattress for a while, one hand resting on her daughter's hair, until the little girl's breathing became slow and even. Then she went into the kitchen, turned on the small lamp above the refrigerator, sat down, and remained there for a very long time. She didn't cry. She simply sat with both hands resting on the wooden table, where the paint had peeled away, staring at the wall in front of her. And there was no clear thought in her mind except one thing repeating over and over, that she had held that box in both hands, that she had gone straight downstairs, and that she had signed her name in a ledger. The picture of the woman in the red cape was taped to the refrigerator door beside the follow-up appointment notice. At that same moment, in an office several blocks away, Dahlia Brooks still hadn't gone home. She had spent the afternoon doing what any attorney should do first, and what most people forgot to do: finding out who the missing item actually belonged to. No one in the hotel's records had reported a bracelet missing. No guest on that floor had filed a claim. Gordon Slate's statement said the jewelry belonged to an important guest who wished to remain anonymous. And that was the kind of answer people usually accepted in the hotel business, because important guests always existed, and they always wished to remain anonymous. Dahlia didn't accept it. She took another route. A bracelet like that didn't fall from the sky. It had been purchased somewhere, and in that city, the stores capable of selling such a piece could be counted on 2 hands with fingers to spare. She called them one by one. At the 4th store, someone remembered it. The piece had been collected several days earlier, paid for in a single payment, and the invoice had been issued to a legal entity rather than an individual. Dahlia asked for the name of that entity, then searched for it in the state's business registration database. The name that appeared belonged to a limited liability company registered to a mailbox in the suburbs, with no employees, no declared business activity, and only a short history. She continued searching for the registered representative. That name led to a second company, and the second company wasn't a mailbox. It was a contractor specializing in the installation and inspection of fire protection systems for major construction projects throughout the state. Dahlia Brooks sat straighter in her chair. She pulled the documents for the tower closer, opened them to the contractor list, and found that exact name on the third line. She stared at the screen for a while, then picked up a pen and wrote one short sentence on a sheet of scrap paper, writing it for herself, the way people wrote something down so they could believe that what they had just realized was real. The bracelet had never belonged to any guest. It had been purchased by a contractor and placed in the suite intended for the person who would sign the inspection approval for the building about to open. And a housekeeper happened to find it, lifted it with both hands, and signed her name in a ledger. The following morning, Dahlia Brooks arranged to meet Tessa at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from her apartment building because she suspected the woman wouldn't want to enter a law office. She was right. Tessa arrived 10 minutes early and took the table farthest inside. And because school was closed that day, she had brought her daughter with her. Maisie sat at the next table with a glass of milk and several colored pencils, precisely far enough from the 2 women that she couldn't hear what they were saying. "I need you to confirm something," Dahlia said. She opened her briefcase, removed a stack of documents, placed them on the table, and spread them into 2 rows. "That night, when you were standing in the office, you said you saw 2 folders lying open beside each other. Do you remember what they looked like?" "I didn't read them," Tessa said. "I don't need you to read. I need you to look." Tessa lowered her eyes. The table was covered with pages containing charts, floor plans, and rows of symbols she didn't understand. But at the top of each page was a bold heading, and she immediately recognized it. The words "Fire Protection System" printed between 2 lines. And she also recognized the faint sense of unease she had felt that night when her eyes passed over 2 tables of figures, one longer than the other. "This one," she said, placing her finger on a page. The page on the left looked like this. The table on the right was shorter. Dahlia nodded slowly and remained silent for several seconds. Then, she pulled another page from the stack, the first page of the file, bearing the name of the company responsible for installation and inspection at the top, and turned it so Tessa could see it properly. "And this is the contractor," she said. "The company that bought the bracelet is registered beneath this name." Tessa looked down. At the top of the page, printed in black letters, were 2 words, "Keystone Fire." She said nothing. She didn't move. At some point, the coffee in front of her stopped steaming, and from the next table came the sound of a colored pencil rolling across the wood and falling to the floor. Maisie bent down to pick it up, and Tessa still didn't move. "Miss Marlowe, I hear you. What's wrong?" Tessa looked up, and Dahlia Brooks, who had sat across from hundreds of clients in her life and believed she had witnessed every kind of silence, realized that she had never seen silence like this. 3 years ago, Tessa said, her voice perfectly even, "my husband went inside a warehouse on the west side of the city. Someone was still trapped inside. The building's fire suppression system didn't work." She placed both hands on the table, one on either side of the page, without touching it. "They investigated for 6 months. In the end, they concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to hold the installation company responsible." Dahlia didn't ask the next question. She didn't need to. "It was this exact name," Tessa said. That afternoon, she took Maisie to Mrs. Reyes's apartment to play, then returned home alone. She didn't turn on the main light. She pulled out a chair, sat down, and took the tin box from the top drawer. But this time, she didn't open the compartment where she kept the money. She lifted the paper lining at the bottom of the box, and beneath it was a set of documents folded into quarters, the edges yellowed along the creases. The final investigation report. It had arrived in the mail one autumn morning 3 years earlier. She had read it exactly once, folded it, and hidden it there. She hadn't opened it again in 3 years. She opened it now. The small lamp above the refrigerator cast a circle of yellow light onto the table, just wide enough to illuminate a single sheet of paper. She read the first page, then the second. She read slowly, tracing each line with her finger like someone learning to read. And there were passages she read twice, then 3 times. One section discussed the water pressure at the sprinkler heads in the eastern area. Another stated that the valve system hadn't been connected according to the final construction drawings. One passage said the investigative team had been unable to determine when the discrepancy between the plans and the actual installation had occurred. And near the end, in the appendix listing the companies involved, was the name she had seen on another document that morning. Outside the window, the city gradually darkened, then slowly began to brighten again. Tessa Marlowe sat at the kitchen table all night with the report open before her, and she didn't stand up once. When the sky behind the rooftops began turning gray, she picked up the phone and dialed. It rang 1.5 times. Dahlia Brooks speaking. "It's Tessa Marlowe. Are you all right?" "Listen to me," Tessa said, and her voice didn't tremble at all. "Since yesterday, I've believed my job was to prove that I didn't take that bracelet. It's different now." "Miss," Brooks didn't interrupt from the other end of the line. "I'm not a witness anymore," Tessa said. "I'm the victim's family. And this time, I have something no one had 3 years ago." Tessa asked Dahlia Brooks exactly one question that morning, and after a silence longer than necessary, the attorney replied that she wasn't permitted to reveal a name, but if someone chose to go there on her own, that was her own decision, and the address wasn't a secret because it appeared on the sign outside the building. That afternoon, Tessa took the bus downtown, wearing the only decent coat she still owned, and sat in the waiting area outside the office on the top floor for nearly an hour. The assistant named Peter Vance came out 3 times to ask whether she wanted anything to drink, and all 3 times she thanked him and declined. When the door opened, she stood and walked inside, and she recognized the man beside the glass wall immediately because she had seen him twice before, once at the end of the upper floor hallway, and once behind the stone column in the lobby, and both times he had been standing perfectly still. "I came to tell you something," she said. "Please sit down." "I'd rather stand." Ronan Cale nodded and remained standing. "You hired that attorney," Tessa said. "I didn't ask her. She didn't tell me. But the images she placed on the table that day came from your camera system, and in that building, only one person had the authority to retrieve them." She stood straight, both hands gripping the strap of her bag. "I came to thank you, and to tell you that I'll pay her fees. I can't pay everything at once, but I'll pay." "Why?" "Because I don't take what doesn't belong to me," Tessa said. "Not even kindness." Ronan studied her for a moment. The air conditioner hummed very softly in the room, and there was no other sound. "Let me ask you one question," he said. "All right. That night, when you opened the box and saw what was inside, how long did you stand there before deciding to take it downstairs?" Tessa didn't answer immediately, and he didn't hurry her. "Not even 1 second, she said. "I did think about it. I thought about it for the length of one breath because my daughter has a medical appointment at the end of the month, and I don't have enough money. But I didn't hesitate for even 1 second." She lowered her eyes, then raised them again. "Because if I had taken it, what right would I ever have to tell my daughter about her father?" Ronan Cale turned toward the glass wall. Below, traffic flowed along the avenue, and the lake in the distance had turned the color of lead. He stood that way for a while before speaking, and when he did, he still didn't turn around. "My mother once did the same kind of work you do, at a hotel in Milwaukee. One day, they accused her of stealing from a guest, and they said it to her in the middle of the hallway, in front of her 8-year-old son, who was sitting at the end of a row of chairs waiting for her shift to end." He paused. Not one person in that building stepped forward to speak for her. Tessa said nothing. There were moments when the kindest thing a person could do was leave the silence unfilled. "I've entered many hotels in my life," Ronan said, and now he turned back to her. "Every one of them has someone like you. The person who goes to work before sunrise, the person who knows where the building leaks, the person whose name the people sitting on the top floor can't remember. And whenever something happens, that person is always standing closest to the door, so that person is the one they push outside." He walked to the desk and placed one hand on the wood. "No one has ever stepped forward. This time, someone did." "I didn't ask anyone to step forward," Tessa said. "I know. That's exactly why." She remained silent for a moment. Then she spoke, and her voice had changed from the way it sounded when she entered the room. "Mr. Cale, there's something you don't know. The company behind that bracelet is the same company that installed the fire suppression system in the building where my husband stayed behind 3 years ago." Ronan Cale didn't ask her to repeat herself. He simply stood there, and Tessa saw something pass very quickly across his face, something she would think about many times afterward because it wasn't pity. "Do you believe it's still there?" he asked. "Believe what?" "That the same thing is still inside the tower that's about to open." "I don't need to believe it," Tessa said. "I spent all last night reading their investigation report. I know what happens when people sign a piece of paper without climbing to the upper floors to inspect what they're approving." 2 days later, Celeste Hargrove's office called Tessa. The caller was an assistant with an exceptionally courteous voice who said that Mrs. Hargrove wished to meet with her privately on Friday morning, that this would be a conversation held in good faith, and that Mrs. Hargrove rarely made time for meetings of this kind. Tessa agreed. She agreed because Dahlia had told her to accept, and because she wanted to look that woman directly in the face one more time, without handcuffs around her wrists. But that meeting never took place on Friday morning, because at nearly 2 o'clock that morning, Tessa's phone rang in the darkness. She had fallen asleep in the chair with the file resting on her lap. She answered before the second ring, and the person on the other end was Mrs. Reyes, and the older woman had spoken only half a sentence when Tessa rose to her feet. She couldn't remember when she put on her coat. She couldn't remember whether she had locked the door. The taxi Mrs. Reyes had called for her was waiting on the street below, and throughout the ride, Tessa sat on the edge of the back seat, with both hands gripping the back of the seat in front of her, silently repeating something that never became words, not a prayer, only her daughter's name over and over again. At the emergency room entrance, someone pointed her in the right direction. She ran down the hallway, her shoes striking the vinyl floor, passing closed doors and empty chairs, and when she reached the room, someone in a white coat raised a hand and stopped her very gently, and behind that person, the door closed. Tessa stood outside that door. She didn't pound on it. She didn't ask anyone a question. She simply stood there with one hand pressed against the wall, and she remained that way for a very long time, long enough for the hallway lights to begin blurring at the edges of her vision, long enough for a nurse passing by to turn around and ask whether she wanted to sit down. Tessa shook her head. She remained standing because she was afraid that sitting down would mean the waiting was going to last a long time. By the time the door opened, dawn was near. The cardiologist on duty that night was a woman about Tessa's age, and she spoke her first sentence very quickly, saying that the little girl was all right, that everything was under control, and when Tessa heard those words, she had to steady herself against the wall. "But I need to tell you something," the doctor said, and her voice slowed. Her original surgery date was at the end of the year. "After tonight, we can't keep that date. We need to perform the surgery within a month." Tessa nodded. She nodded several times in succession, as though the words might become easier to carry if she nodded enough. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand. You can go in and see her. She's awake." Inside the room, Maisie lay on her side, her hair damp against one side of her forehead, and she turned toward the door the moment she heard her mother. "Mommy, I'm here." Tessa sat on the edge of the bed and took that small hand in hers, and she kept her voice normal. And she had spent 3 years practicing how to keep her voice normal, so by now she was very good at it. "Mommy, the doctor said something really funny." "What did she say?" "She said my heart was running as fast as a rabbit today." Maisie spoke, then laughed, the wide open-mouthed kind of laugh that wrinkled the bridge of her nose. "But I like rabbits, so I think it's all right." Tessa laughed. Her laughter was real, and she bent down to kiss her daughter's hair, and she stayed there until the little girl fell asleep again. Then she walked into the hallway, sat in a plastic chair, and opened the paper they had given her at the admissions desk. It was an estimate of the cost of the surgery, showing the portion covered by insurance and the portion the patient would have to pay, and the amount on the final line was greater than everything she had ever possessed in her life put together, many times greater than what she had in the tin box inside the top drawer, and beneath it was a line of small print, stating that the deadline for confirmation was 10 days. Tessa folded the paper in half. Then she opened it and read it again. Then she folded it once more and sat motionless with both hands resting on her knees. At the far end of the hallway, the door leading to the elevators opened, and the sound of shoes striking the floor followed, a steady, decisive sequence that Tessa had heard once in her life and would never mistake for any other sound. She looked up. From the other end of the hallway, wearing an expensive light-colored coat, Celeste Hargrove was walking toward her. Celeste stopped 2 steps from the plastic chair and looked through the window of the room behind Tessa, where a child was sleeping, and a nurse sat beside the bed writing notes. "You canceled your meeting with me," she said. "Something came up." "I know something came up. That's why I came here." She didn't sit in the chair beside Tessa. She remained standing, opened the handbag in her hand, and took out a thin stack of papers fastened neatly together, along with a pen. "I'll be brief because we're both tired. This is an agreement. The corporation will pay the full cost of your daughter's surgery, with no limit, including any additional expenses, and the hospital stay afterward. There's also a separate payment for you. Enough money that you won't have to work another night shift for many years." Tessa looked at the papers. "In exchange for what?" "In exchange for one signature," Celeste said. "You confirm that the incident that day was a misunderstanding that has been resolved to the satisfaction of both parties, that you have no complaints or claims, and that you won't speak to the press or any third party about anything you saw or heard while working at the hotel." She placed the papers on the empty chair between them and laid the pen on top. "I know about your daughter's condition," she added. "You submitted an application for assistance with her medical expenses to the Employee Welfare Fund. It was denied, and I was the person who signed the denial." Inside the room beyond the window, the nurse stood, adjusted the child's blanket, then sat down again. The little girl didn't move. Tessa picked up the papers. She read the first page, then the second, and she read every word instead of skimming, just as she had read the investigation report beneath the kitchen light several nights earlier. Then she picked up the pen. Her hand trembled. She looked at the blank line at the bottom of the page, and in that moment, she could see the room behind her with perfect clarity. She could see the morning her daughter would be taken into surgery, while her mother didn't have to ask anyone a single question about money. She held the pen that way for nearly half a minute. Then she set it down. "No," she said. Celeste's expression didn't change. "Did you read it carefully?" "I read it carefully." "You're buying my silence about what I saw inside your building." Tessa placed the papers back on the chair. "Mrs. Hargrove, your tower opens in 3 weeks. Hundreds of people will move into that building to work and sleep there. And on the upper floors, there are pipes that lead nowhere." Celeste said nothing. "My husband died in a building like that," Tessa said. "Someone signed a document allowing it to open. I don't know who that person was, and I'm no longer looking for them, but I won't be the second person to sign." A cart rolled past at the far end of the hallway, and its sound slowly faded. Celeste bent down, picked up the papers, folded them, and returned them to her bag, performing each movement very slowly. "You're under investigation," she said. "The authorities will reconsider the fitness of a person in your situation to raise a child." Then she turned away. The sound of her shoes diminished along the hallway, passed through the door leading to the elevators, and disappeared completely. Tessa Marlowe lowered herself into the plastic chair. She managed to sit with her back straight for several seconds, then folded forward, covered her face with both hands, and wept. She made no sound as she cried, but her shoulders shook, and she pressed her palms tightly against her eyes because there was a window behind her, and she didn't want her daughter to see her if she woke up. She cried that way for a long time. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps. When she raised her head, a man in a black coat was sitting one chair away, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the wall across from them instead of looking at her. He didn't offer her a tissue. He didn't place a hand on her shoulder. He simply sat there. "I'll take care of the surgery," Ronan Cale said. Tessa wiped her face with the cuff of her sleeve. "Mr. Cale, I've already told you. I don't take what doesn't belong to me. I know what you said. I heard you very clearly that day." He still didn't turn his head. "But I won't allow you to refuse this. You don't have the right to decide for me." "That's right," he said. "I don't, but you just turned down a check so that hundreds of strangers could have a safe place to work. You've already paid your share of the price." He stood and fastened the button of his coat. "Stay here with your little girl. Someone from the hospital will call you tomorrow morning, and they won't ask you a single question about money." The court issued a subpoena requiring the original security data from the upper floors to be turned over on a Monday. Before 7 o'clock that Monday morning, Peter Vance called Ronan Cale, and his voice didn't sound like his own. "There's nothing. Be clear. I just went down to the server room with someone from the technical team. All the data from that night is gone. It wasn't corrupted, and it wasn't a drive failure. It was deleted, and the offsite backup was deleted at the same time." "Who had access to that room?" Silence lingered at the other end of the line. "Very few people, sir. That afternoon, the hotel's attorneys filed their objection, and its contents were brief to the point of cruelty. The 2 still images submitted by the defense hadn't been accompanied by the original data sequence. There were no system logs, and no means whatsoever of verifying their timestamps or integrity. In their words, those were two images that could have been created by anyone, anywhere, at any time. Dahlia Brooks read the objection twice, then set it down. Procedurally, they're right, she said. Without the originals, those two images carry no more weight than a blank sheet of paper. Then I'll testify, Ronan said. She looked at him. I was in that hallway that night. I saw her come down from the suite, with the box in her hands. I can say that under oath. Dahlia Brooks didn't answer at once, and that hesitation delivered her answer before she had the chance to speak. Mr. Cale, she said, I'm going to be blunt, because paying me to offer you comfort would be a waste of money. Go ahead. The moment you take the witness stand, they won't ask you about that hallway. They'll ask you about your father. They'll read aloud everything the newspapers printed 20 years ago. They'll ask whether you inherited his business, and you'll have to answer yes. Then they'll turn to the jury and ask whether they intend to believe the word of a man who carries that name. She tapped one finger against the objection on the table. You won't merely fail to save her. You'll become the reason people don't believe her. Ronan Cale stood in the middle of the room and said nothing for a while. He had spent 7 years doing one thing, pulling his family's name out of the shadows and placing it on licensed buildings and payrolls with taxes properly paid. And he had believed that once the work was finished, that name would finally be fit for use. Now he knew it wasn't. It could still be used to frighten people. It couldn't be used to tell one simple truth. All right, he said. I won't take the stand. He returned to his office and summoned Peter Vance. I need a list of every person who had physical access to the server room over the past week, including anyone who accompanied them, including anyone who only went in to retrieve something. And I need the keycard logs, not a report, but the raw data extract. Yes, sir. Don't tell anyone I asked for this. The list arrived 3 hours later. Ronan read it from the bottom upward, because he had learned long ago that whatever people wanted to hide was often placed where the eye moved fastest. And there it was. A single card swipe close to midnight, the night before the subpoena was issued, made with the card of someone who had no reason to be on that floor at that hour, someone who wasn't responsible for technology or security, someone no one in that building had ever thought to investigate. Ronan laid the paper on his desk. He sat motionless in his chair as the sky beyond the glass turned the color of lead, and in his mind he returned to an evening not long before, when a silver-haired man had walked into his office without knocking, placed a blue folder on his desk, lowered himself into a chair with a weary breath, and said that he was the one who had brought in the project, that he had sat with the other party until 2 o'clock in the morning, and that Ronan should just sign it so he could go home and get some sleep. Ronan Cale reached for the telephone, then stopped and set it down. He called Peter Vance on the internal line. Find out the ownership structure of the fire protection contractor listed on the Hargrove project. I want every ownership interest, including those held in other people's names. Half an hour later, Peter knocked and entered, then stood in the middle of the room with a sheet of paper in his hand without offering it to Ronan. Mr. Cale, say it. One ownership interest is held through 2 layers of intermediary companies, Peter said. The ultimate beneficiary is Mr. Doyle. Tessa received the news over the phone while sitting in the row of chairs outside the cardiology department, still holding the appointment sheet they had just printed for her. Dahlia Brooks spoke slowly and told her everything, that the original data was gone, that the 2 images could no longer stand on their own, that the other side had filed a statement arguing they could have been created by anyone. Tessa listened to the end. She thanked Dahlia for calling. Then she ended the call and sat motionless with the paper resting on her lap. At the far end of the hallway, a family was laughing because their little one had just been cleared to go home, and Tessa looked at them without truly seeing anything. 3 years ago, they had told her there wasn't enough evidence. Now, once again, she was holding the very thing she had held 3 years before, the truth that no one was required to believe. That night, on the west side of the city, in an old cemetery bordered by an iron fence and ancient maple trees, Ronan Cale stood before a gravestone, bearing nothing but a name and 2 numbers. He remained there for a long while without removing his gloves. I've spent my whole life learning one thing, he said. Learning how not to be like you. The wind moved between the rows of graves, stirring the dry maple leaves across the grass. But you were right about one thing. A man who betrays you from inside your own house can't be left alone. He looked at the gravestone for another moment. I just choose a different kind of ground. The warehouse stood in the old industrial district by the river, a long building of corrugated metal that his family had kept since the days when his father was still alive. Now it was used only to store a few old cars and several empty shelving units. Fergus Doyle was brought there close to midnight. He stepped inside and stopped at the door. He knew this place. He had stood inside that very warehouse many times during an era when meetings there meant only one thing. And he understood perfectly what it meant to be summoned there at that hour. His face was deathly pale beneath the hanging lights. In the middle of the warehouse stood a wooden table and 2 chairs. Ronan Cale sat on one side. "Sit down, Uncle Fergus." Fergus Doyle lowered himself into the chair. His hands rested on his lap, then moved to the table, then dropped back down again. "Ronan," he said, "just listen to me first." "No." Ronan placed a file on the table. He didn't slide it across. He simply left it there, directly between them. "You already know what's in here." Fergus looked down at the file but didn't reach for it. "The ownership interest held through 2 layers of companies," Ronan said. "That contractor. The keycard logs from the server room. And the blue folder you brought into my office the night you told me to sign it and be done so you could go home and sleep." The warehouse was so quiet that they could hear the river striking the embankment behind it. "I was in debt," Fergus said. His voice had grown hoarse. "I was in debt, Ronan, and I thought I could move the money around and put it back before anyone knew. I worked with your father before you were old enough to drive." "I know how long you worked with my father," Ronan said. "That's exactly what makes this difficult." He fell silent for a moment. "Do you know what my father would have done to you in this warehouse?" "I know. He would have buried you beneath this floor, and no one would ever have come looking for you. You stood here and watched him do it to others." Fergus Doyle didn't answer. He sat perfectly still as a single bead of sweat ran from his temple to his jaw. "I'm not going to do that," Ronan said. Fergus looked up. "I'm letting you live," Ronan said. "I'm letting you walk out of here tonight, with both legs intact. Then tomorrow, you'll sit in a courtroom filled with reporters and members of your family, and you'll listen while a woman who cleans hotel rooms tells the entire story from the beginning, slowly, in front of everyone, and tells them what you did." He rose and buttoned his coat. "My father took lives. I take names. You decide for yourself which one lasts longer." "Ronan. Uncle Fergus." He paused at the edge of the table. "I used to let you walk into my office without knocking. You were the only one." The following morning, the file was delivered to federal investigators, along with the server room access logs, the contractor's ownership structure, and a sworn statement from the head of the technical department. Ronan Cale didn't keep a single copy for himself. The invitation was sent on Wednesday morning, polite and brief, and the chief executive of the fire protection contractor accepted in less than an hour. His name was Wendell Pruitt, a man of about 60, with a firm handshake and the voice of someone accustomed to standing before the city council. He arrived at the restaurant in River North precisely on time, dressed in a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. And he walked in with the bearing of a man who believed he had been invited there to negotiate. The restaurant belonged to Ronan Cale, and that evening it was open for only one table. Wine was poured. The appetizer was served. Ronan asked about Pruitt's family, about several projects in the southern part of the state, and about the predictions that winter would arrive early that year. Wendell Pruitt answered every question, growing more comfortable by the minute, and by the middle of the main course, he was pouring himself another glass of wine. He finished everything on his plate. The server cleared it away and brought nothing to replace it. Ronan Cale waited until the kitchen door had closed. Then he placed the first sheet of paper on the table. "This is a list of the banks currently providing lines of credit to your company," he said. "This morning, all 4 banks sent notices suspending those lines pending further review. You can check your inbox right now if you'd like." The smile remained on Wendell Pruitt's face, but it had stopped moving. Ronan set down the second sheet of paper. "And this is a list of the contracts your company is currently performing or waiting to sign. This afternoon, 5 developers on this list suspended their contracts with you. The remaining 2 will do the same tomorrow morning. I know because I spoke to them." "Mr. Cale," Pruitt said, and his voice had changed. "I think we can sit down and discuss this. We're already sitting." Ronan took out the third item and placed it between the 2 sheets of paper. It wasn't a document. It was a small photograph of a man in a firefighter's uniform, standing in front of a ladder truck, holding his helmet in one hand and smiling at the person behind the camera. "His name was Jesse Marlowe," Ronan said. 3 years ago, He entered a warehouse on the west side of the city. The system inside that building was installed by your company. Wendell Pruitt looked at the photograph. He didn't reach for it, nor did he push it away. That matter was investigated, he said. The conclusion was that there wasn't enough evidence. I know what the conclusion was, Ronan said. I also know you've slept soundly for 3 years because of it. He stacked the 2 sheets of paper neatly together, leaving the photograph on top. Mr. Pruitt, I want you to understand exactly what's happening tonight, because I think you deserve to know. I'm not laying a hand on you. No one will come to your house. No one will call your wife, and no one will stand outside your office. I'm doing only one thing. I'm making sure this entire city never touches you again. No bank will lend you money. No developer will sign a contract with you. No one will answer the phone when you call. He leaned back in his chair. My father had another name for this. He called it burying a man without having to dig. Wendell Pruitt sat motionless for a long time. He looked down at his hands, then out the window, then back at the photograph. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all the resonance of a man accustomed to addressing the city council. If I give you something, he said, how much of this will you undo? I'm not promising you anything. Then why should I give it to you? Because tomorrow morning, someone will come knocking on your company's door, Ronan said. And by then, you'll have only 2 choices. Either you're the man who hands it over, or you're the man they take away. Pruitt opened his leather briefcase. He removed a clipped stack of documents and placed it on the table, keeping his hand on it for 1 more second before letting go. This is the internal file from the warehouse project, he said. Meeting minutes, inspection photographs, and written instructions ordering parts of the work to be removed so the project could stay on schedule. The investigative team didn't have this back then. Ronan Cale looked at the documents. He didn't open them. With a slight nod, he called the server back into the room. Would you care for dessert? The order authorizing an independent inspection was signed on Thursday afternoon, and at 8 o'clock Friday morning, a court-appointed technical team was scheduled to enter the new tower, open the service ceilings on the upper floors, and inspect the actual condition of the piping. The news reached Gordon Slate before the workday was over. That night, Earl Dempsey began his shift at 10 o'clock, made his rounds through the 2 pump rooms in the basement as he did every night, and at close to 1 o'clock in the morning, he stepped into the courtyard for a cigarette, the narrow space wedged between the old hotel and the new tower. He stood there and looked up at the dark mass of the building above him, and then he saw it. A blue-white glow flashed behind a window on one of the upper floors, vanished, then flashed again. A short series of flashes, a pause, then another series. Earl had been doing this work for nearly 20 years, and he knew what that light was before his mind could offer any other explanation. Someone was welding up there. His hand trembled as he crushed the cigarette against the concrete. He stood motionless for several seconds, and during those few seconds he thought of many things. He thought of the pension that was still 2 years away. He thought of the morning they had told him to leave the lobby. He thought of the 3 reports he had submitted that no one had read. Then he went down to the basement. He didn't run. He walked quickly and steadily, because he knew exactly what he had to do, and the order in which he had to do it. First, he opened the service elevator control cabinet and cut power to both cars, placing them in landing stop mode while the lights inside the cars remained on. Second, he walked down the service corridor to the material elevator door and locked it with his own key. Third, he stood before the tower's fire alarm control panel, the same panel he had inspected once a week throughout the construction project, and activated the alarm throughout the entire building. The bells erupted simultaneously on every floor of an unoccupied building, and inside that hollow tower, they sounded louder than anything Earl had ever heard. Emergency exit lights came on along the stairwells. Every fire exit released its lock automatically exactly as designed, and the signal went directly to the city fire department's dispatch center. Earl Dempsey stood in the basement, with one hand still resting on the control panel, and over the roar of the alarm, he said aloud to no one that the stairwells were clear. No one was trapped, and they could all walk down. The fire trucks arrived less than 6 minutes later. The first 2 trucks parked across the roadway, their lights sweeping over the glass, and the firefighters entered through the main entrance before spreading out and climbing the stairwells. They encountered 2 men on a landing between 2 of the upper floors, making their way down with faces drained of color. One still had a welding mask pushed up onto his forehead, and the other carried a canvas bag. No one was injured. No one had been locked inside anywhere. The 2 men were brought down to the ground. where they were asked what they were doing at that hour inside a building that hadn't yet passed final inspection, and neither of them could offer anything resembling a sensible answer. On that floor, the firefighters' flashlights swept across the service ceiling where the panels had been removed. The welding machine still lay hot on the floor beside several lengths of steel pipe that had already been cut, and above their heads, running along the ceiling, was the fire suppression piping, painted red, fully fitted with supports, passing through precisely the locations specified in the plans, until it neared the end of the span and stopped. There was no valve, there was no connection. There was only a capped length of pipe suspended from the ceiling of a building that was about to open. The commander of the fire crew that night was a man of about 40 named Bill Hendricks. He stood beneath that pipe for a long time, long enough for the two firefighters beside him to exchange a glance. He removed his gloves and held them in one hand. "Photograph everything," he said. "Every section. No one touches anything." Then he continued, standing there. The young firefighter nearest him asked whether he was all right. 3 years ago, I carried a man out of a building exactly like this one," Bill Hendricks said. "He was 2 steps ahead of me." He raised his eyes to the dead-end pipe once more. "This time, no one is going to carry anyone out of any building." Down in the basement, the alarm had fallen silent, and Earl Dempsey lowered himself onto the plastic chair beside the pump room, placed both hands on his knees, and remained there until someone came down to summon him for an interview with the investigative team. The photograph of the capped pipe appeared on the front page of the city's largest newspaper on Saturday morning, accompanied by a caption of only one sentence, stating that this was what hung above the heads of the people who were about to move into the building and begin working there. From that moment on, everything came crashing down in sequence, and it happened so quickly that people later had to reconstruct it according to the hour. At 9 o'clock Saturday morning, Annette Rowe arrived at the headquarters of the city's building authority just as the doors opened. She carried the corrected safety certificate bearing her own signature, the handover ledger with its torn, perforated stub, marked by a yellow note, and a handwritten statement 3 pages long. The intake officer asked whether she had an attorney with her. She said she didn't. That statement contained one line that would later be quoted many times: that she had signed a document based on a summary submitted by someone else, without opening the underlying file herself, and that being deceived didn't mean she was blameless. At 11 o'clock that same morning, Gordon Slate was arrested at his home in the northern suburbs. He didn't resist, and he said nothing in the car. By that afternoon, when he sat across from 2 federal investigators with his attorney beside him, he began to talk, and he spoke like a man who had spent the entire night calculating and had come to understand that the only thing he could still sell was what he knew. He told them about the bracelet. He told them about the page torn from the ledger and the locker in the basement. Then he told them about a brief meeting on the top floor several weeks earlier, when he had brought up the installation schedule and explained that the work on the upper floors couldn't be completed in time for the opening date. "What did she say to you?" one of the investigators asked. "She didn't look up from the papers she was reading," Slate said. "She told me, 'Don't bring that to my desk right now. I don't want to hear it.'" Somewhere in the room, a pen stopped moving across paper. "Are you certain those were her exact words?" "I remember every word," Gordon Slate said. "I walked out of that room, understanding that I had just been given complete discretion." That same Saturday afternoon, in another office, Dahlia Brooks placed a stack of files before 2 prosecutors and made one brief statement. "You're looking for a coincidence. There isn't one." She spread out a list of the projects that the fire protection contractor had completed across the state over many years, and beside each project was the name of the regional inspector who had approved it. The same name appeared again and again, year after year, project after project. "This isn't a man who was bought once," she said. "This is a man they kept feeding." Tessa Marlowe sat at the far end of the table during that meeting because Dahlia had asked her to be present. She studied the list spread before them, and her eyes stopped at a line near the bottom, the name of a project she knew so well that she didn't need to finish reading it. She pulled the sheet closer. She looked at the column beside it. Then she opened her purse, removed a stack of papers, folded into quarters with edges that had yellowed, turned to the appendix near the end, and placed the 2 pages side by side on the table. The same signature. She said nothing. She simply pushed both pages toward the 2 prosecutors and sat upright again. The inspector was summoned for questioning on Monday morning. He was a man in his 50s, whose wife accompanied him as far as the door before he entered alone, and he sat down before anyone had the chance to offer him a chair. They showed him the list of projects. They showed him the internal warehouse file, the meeting minutes, and written instructions ordering parts of the work to be removed so the project could remain on schedule, evidence the investigative team 3 years earlier had never possessed. They showed him the receipt for the bracelet and the name of the legal entity that had paid for it. Then they asked whether he wanted to call an attorney. The inspector stared down at his hands for a long time. "I read it in the newspaper," he said. "What that woman said. That her husband died inside a building someone had signed a paper allowing to open." No one interrupted him. "I signed one signature that kept a firefighter from coming home," he said. "I won't sign a second one." He cooperated fully that very morning, and his statement included a detailed description of a velvet-covered box that had been arranged to await him in the suite, reserved for him and his wife, a gift that, in the end, he had never even seen. The laundromat stood on a corner on the south side of the city and remained open all night, and Tessa still worked there 3 nights a week because her daughter's surgery had been scheduled, but life continued to charge its price 1 week at a time. Close to midnight that night, the glass door swung open, and the person who entered wasn't a regular customer. Celeste Hargrove stood in the middle of the narrow aisle, wearing an expensive coat, without an assistant or an attorney beside her. And for a while she said nothing, her eyes moving over the turning machines and the laundry baskets stacked one upon another. Tessa was folding towels. She didn't stop. "This place smells exactly the same," Celeste said. Tessa continued folding. "The same as where?" "The laundry room in the basement of a hotel in another city," Celeste said. "My mother worked there. I used to sit and wait for her shift to end on a plastic chair beside the dryers." She took 2 more steps inside. "She wore a uniform like yours. The color was a little different, that's all." Tessa placed the towel she had just folded on the stack and picked up the next one. "One day, a guest reported her watch missing," Celeste said. "They called my mother into the middle of the hallway and accused her in front of everyone, in front of me. I was 12 years old. They couldn't find the watch anywhere, and 3 weeks later, the guest found it inside her own suitcase, but no one ever called my mother back to tell her." The dryer at the end of the room stopped and sounded a single chime. "My mother lived for another 20 years, Celeste said, "but she never raised her head again. I grew up watching her move through her own home as though she were walking through someone else's." Tessa finished folding the towel and set it down. For the first time, she turned around. "Then why did you laugh?" Celeste didn't answer immediately. "Because I saw you standing in that lobby wearing that uniform," she said, "and I saw my mother. For 1 second, I saw her exactly as she had been, and I had to make that image small very quickly, before it had the chance to grow inside my chest. The fastest way I knew was to laugh at it." Only the sound of water moving inside the machines remained in the laundromat. Tessa stood there, still holding the next towel without having opened it. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, her voice no louder than the machines. "Your mother was destroyed by someone with power, someone who stood above her and made an accusation, and no one bothered to find out whether it was true." "Yes." "Then you spent your entire life becoming that very person." Celeste Hargrove said nothing. "You thought you were avenging your mother," Tessa said. "You weren't avenging her. You betrayed her a second time. The first time, someone else did it. This time, it was her own daughter." The glass door opened behind them, and a man entered carrying a basket of clothes. He walked between the 2 women without looking at either of them, emptied his clothes into an unused machine, and fed coins into the slot. The sound of the machine starting filled the silence. "Are you going to say that in court?" Celeste asked. "No," Tessa said. "In court, I'll only describe what I did and what I saw. What I just said was meant only for you, because you came all the way here, and I thought you should hear it once from someone wearing a uniform." She turned back to the laundry. She opened the towel, shook it once, and began to fold it. "You don't forgive me," Celeste said. "That isn't mine to do," Tessa said without looking up. "I still have a shift to finish before morning." Celeste Hargrove remained in that narrow aisle for another half-minute, surrounded by the scent of detergent and the heat of the dryers. Then she turned and walked out. The glass door closed behind her. Tessa folded the last stack of towels, arranged them in a basket, and continued with the next load until daylight came. At 9 o'clock the following morning, inside the courthouse on Dearborn Street, the courtroom doors opened, and people began to enter. There weren't enough seats in the courtroom that day. People stood along the rear wall, and in the 3rd row, a plainly dressed woman sat beside her attorney, with both hands resting on her lap. Celeste Hargrove pleaded guilty to charges involving construction, safety records, and interference with the investigation, contrary to the written advice of her defense attorney. When the judge asked whether the defendant wished to say anything before sentencing, she rose, and on the table before her lay a prepared statement, typed and underlined in several places. She didn't pick it up. "Your Honor, I'm going to say 3 names. Somewhere in the room, someone set down a pen. Earl Dempsey. He worked in maintenance in my building for nearly 20 years. He wrote 3 reports that accurately described what was happening, submitted them to the proper place, and received confirmation stamps for all 3. In return, my people pushed him onto the night shift. The night he stood in the basement and activated the fire alarm in an empty building was the night he did the work my company should have done months earlier." She paused. "The second person is the inspector who approved our projects for many years. I'm not withholding his name here to make myself appear generous. I mention him because he sat down and told the whole truth of his own accord when no one had the power to force him. A person can stop at any point along that road. He stopped at the last point where there was still time." She placed one hand on the edge of the table. "The third person is Tessa Marlowe. She found something worth more than everything she owned, and she carried it downstairs in both hands, turned it in, and signed her own name in the ledger. I stood in the lobby of my own building and laughed in her face because of the uniform she was wearing. I didn't know her name then. Now the entire country does." Then she fell silent. The silence lasted long enough for the court clerk to look up. "There is a 4th name," Celeste said, "but I don't have the right to speak her name in this room. For 40 years, I never mentioned her even once, because speaking of her would have forced me to look back and see what I had become." No one in the courtroom understood whom she meant. In the 3rd row, Tessa Marlowe lowered her eyes. "The indictment says I did this out of greed," Celeste said. "I'm not saying what follows to excuse myself, because I've already pleaded guilty. I wasn't greedy. I was simply busy. Someone brought a problem to my desk, and I told them not to bring it to me then. I went to my next meeting, and I never thought about it again until someone was placed in handcuffs in my lobby. Greedy people are rare, Your Honor. Busy people are everywhere. If everyone leaves this room remembering me only as a greedy person, then this will happen again in another building whose name we don't yet know." She sat down. Maisie's surgery took place one morning near the end of the month and lasted until noon. Tessa sat in the hallway with both hands resting on her knees, and when the doctor emerged and spoke his first sentence, she had to grip the arm of the chair. Every expense was covered by a fund supporting the families of firefighters, and later, when she asked directly, she was told that the fund had been established only a few days after the afternoon, when she had gone to the top floor and said she would pay the attorney's fees herself. She sat for a long time with that paper in her hands. Then she folded it and put it away, because she had finally come to understand something that had eluded her until that year, that sometimes refusing kindness wasn't self-respect, but merely another way of protecting herself from owing anyone, and that allowing others to be kind to her was also a form of courage. Bill Hendricks came to her home one Saturday afternoon, carrying an old envelope. He said he had kept it for 3 years, and for 3 years he hadn't had the courage to bring it to her. Inside was an unfinished note that had been found in a locker at the fire station. Jesse's handwriting was hurried, only a few lines. On the final line, he had written that if there ever came a day when he didn't return home, she shouldn't teach their daughter that her father had been brave. She should teach her that her father had been terribly afraid. But the sentence ended there. Tessa read it twice. Then she took a pen from the kitchen drawer and finished it with the very words she had spoken to her daughter in that same kitchen before dawn that morning, because someone inside needed Dad. Several weeks later, Sergeant McRae arrived in uniform, carrying an evidence box that had been unsealed according to proper procedure. Inside was the firefighter's badge, with several strands of thread still clinging to the back. She placed it in Tessa's hand and said very little, only that she had needed to ask at 3 different places before she could get it released. The tower opened many months behind schedule, after the entire system on the upper floors had been removed and rebuilt from the beginning under independent supervision. A small bronze plaque was mounted on the wall of the employee corridor, and on the building's first family day, a little girl of 6 ran down that hallway, stopped before the plaque, and sounded out every letter engraved upon it, slowly spelling her father's name until she could read it in full. At the far end of the corridor, a man in a black coat stood leaning against the wall, holding a cup of cocoa made lighter with a splash of milk and a little extra cinnamon, exactly the way the girl liked it, and he waited until she had finished reading before walking over and handing it to her. Neither of the two adults made any promises to the other that day. This story leaves us with one very simple truth: that a person's worth isn't found in the clothes they wear to work, but in whether we're willing to see them. Some people spend their entire lives on the highest floor without ever looking down, while others kneel to scrub the floors at the very bottom, and yet are the ones who keep the whole building standing. Please see one another while there is still time. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so that every day we can listen to more meaningful stories. How do you feel about this story? About Tessa? And about the choices she made? Please leave a comment below, because we sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.